Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this Q&A for the film Convergence, Courage in a Crisis that will be out on Netflix, released globally on October 12th, which is Tuesday of next week. We're so thrilled at Film Independent to have joining us for this version of Film Independent Presents, sponsored by HFPA and our virtual screening partner, Vision Media. I wanted to thank them at the top. And with us today, we have director Orlando von Einsiedel and Hassan Akkad who co-directed the film among 9 other co-directors. So super glad to have you guys with us. I'm Lisa Hasko. I'm the director of artist development for Film Independent, and I'll be moderating the conversation.
The whole world needs to take action and be ready.
COVID-19 can be characterized as a pandemic.
We all want to get on with our lives, but the hard reality is this is not even close to being over.
I just applied to be a cleaner at a hospital.
I want to help because I feel like I can do this.
有信息说武汉医务人员急需志愿者。
At night, I'm a doctor.
Hello, how are you?
During the day, I'm a community activist and organizer.
Here, you gotta change this mask on.
Water! We have to fight this virus as a global community.
Really great to have you here. And we have Hassan joining us from London. And Orlando, where are you?
I'm in Los Angeles at the moment.
Oh, you are?
But I live in London normally.
Okay, you both live in London. All right. And you have known each other from your past work, Orlando? Is that how you know each other?
Yeah, we've been friends for a number of years. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing this film with us. I think it was a much needed salve after the pandemic and seeing all of the really difficult, challenging news that we have throughout the past 2 years. And nice to have a more collective kind of uplifting look at the ways that human beings can be working together and be kind to one another and come to each other's aid during a crisis. And I particularly like about this film that it looks at the opportunity that happens after a crisis and the breakdown that kind of reveals all of our social and political problems that we have across the globe and all the inequities that we saw come from that are always there, but definitely came to the forefront because of the crisis. But questioning whether that can open up and create some opportunity for change, I think is a really special part of your film. So I'll start out with you, Orlando. What was your goal in telling a story about the positivity that arose during the pandemic from multiple viewpoints, instead of just going in, looking at, 1 or 2 characters in one area, and instead taking this more global view?
Well, I guess as any filmmaker, storyteller, the way of trying to make sense of the world is to tell stories about it. And this project began really early on in the pandemic. There was a lot of very upsetting things happening everywhere. Everywhere you looked, on the news, in newspapers. Obviously the virus was spreading over the world, and that was incredibly scary and worrying. But at the same time, there were people taking advantage of that to crack down on freedoms. There was intercountry disputes. There was greed on display, and lots of really, really horrible things. At the same time, just if I take my own street in London, my neighbours were cooking food for each other. People who didn't really interact that often in London. We don't often talk to our neighbours, and then on social media there was lots of examples of incredible acts of altruism and sacrifice. And so the film really began from that as a way to possibly document people doing good things, people doing positive things to help one another in this crisis. And at the same time, also, there was a lot of commentators talking about, you alluded to this too, Lisa, what could happen? Could this lead to some form of change, this global crisis? And of course, at the beginning, we had no idea what that might look like, but we wanted to be open to see if that might lead to anything. And from there, it just was obvious right from the beginning the only way to tell this story was a big global collaboration, working with directors all around the world to tell stories from their own communities and collaborate on something global and I guess unique in that regard. So we began by trying to find stories that kind of represented the globe, represented the world. So stories in Asia and South Asia, in the Far East and South Asia, in the Middle East and Europe and in North America. But we, at the same time, we ended up gravitating as well to countries where the pandemic was, I suppose, was playing out most viciously. And a pattern emerged. Those countries also seemed to be places where governments were often populist, and the virus had been politicized, from mask wearing to ideas about the vaccine. And therefore, because it had been politicized, it became that much harder to treat. And then we started to see those failures in society because the pandemic was that much more violent there. So that ended up shaping where we focused a lot of the stories on.
You're on mute.
You're on mute, Lisa.
Sorry, I was choking and put myself on mute. I'm alive.
Okay, thank God. We were worried.
That would be really sad on camera experience.
I carried on talking anyway. But
I was glad. You did perfect. Maybe they could edit this out or keep it in for levity. So was curious how you identified both the stories and the various co-directors that you had. Are these from past relationships like they are with Hassan, or how did you get to know these people? And how long did that take, knowing this was kind of a in the moment unfolding story?
Well, it was basically from day one. There was this giant effort at outreach from the whole film team. So we got in touch with local film festivals around the world, from from our networks, with local journalism networks, and so there was this global call out, and a number of our co-directors responded to that. In some circumstances, we'd seen some early material that certain directors, an example being Sarah Kaki and Mohammed Reza Aini in Tehran, they'd uploaded a short film from their experience in their apartment in Tehran. And we saw that and we thought it was incredible material. And then there was Amber Fares in the US, who documented the Miami story, and Hassan, who were friends that we started speaking to about hearing what they'd been doing during the pandemic.
Got it. And I mean, massive global coordination. I think is this the biggest project that you think you've put together and directed and produced?
I mean, this is, I've never worked on anything like this. It's enormous, and it actually. It's very different to everything that I've worked on in the past, which has tended to be, I guess, a really small story, and a very limited number of individuals in that world, and maybe that elucidates to something bigger, bigger ideas and themes. And this is like the Avengers version of a documentary, and because of that, it was incredibly challenging. But there was the collaboration, the creative collaboration with directors like Hassan, and all of our directors around the world was extraordinary, and a really beautiful process.
Was it hard to stay focused on the story that you were trying to tell and marry all of these stories together? And what was that like in terms of the edit? It seems like that would be really challenging.
Well, there was a lot of back and forth with all of the directors, and lots of conversations. Me and Hassan would speak fairly regularly about the work that he was doing. But I suppose right at the beginning we tried to set some sorts of standards and filming styles that felt like the best way to do it. But actually, very early on, we abandoned a lot of that, and embraced the different styles and different cameras that everyone was working with. You know, Hassan worked with an iPhone, for instance, and in other countries they're working with much, you know, Mauricio Montero Filho working in Sao Paulo was working on a red camera. So like the real opposite ends of film quality. But I think in the end, the tapestry and the sort of collage of these different looks and styles was something that we embraced, and I hope adds to the richness of the film.
I think so. I think it really speaks to the experience we were all going through. It was kind of a you know, mishmash of experiences and feelings and emotions. So I think that that's perfect for if someone 20 years later watched it and they could really see like how different there were these common threads, but how different it really was in each country. So maybe I will move to Hassan for a moment. Just wondering how you got started in the documentary genre. What's your background and connection?
I started in the documentary. I used to be an English teacher back home. I'm from Damascus, Syria, and I got into the documentary filmmaking when I was on my way to Britain, actually, because I had filmed my entire journey, which was featured in a BBC and a PBS a documentary series about the refugee crisis. So that was my starting point. But I used to tell stories for a living as a teacher, so I've always was fascinated by storytelling. And yeah, since then I've worked on different films, but they were mainly around migration and refugee crisis in Europe and in Syria. When the pandemic hit, I was extremely anxious, I think, and found it really difficult. So in order to get some agency of the situation, I was frantically looking for a job. I found this job at the hospital where they were looking for cleaners, and yeah, I took the job, and it was a very intense environment. It was unlike anything that I've ever experienced in my life. But all my colleagues at the hospital were in that COVID ward. They were immigrants, so we kind of got along, and I felt like we had a lot in common. So I used to like, I was really fascinated by them. So I tweeted something about me being in a hospital. And then I started tweeting about them, sharing their stories. And then I just sent the hospital an email saying that I would love to film if possible. And they said, yeah, feel free to do it. Because they liked what I was doing. I was pushing like a positive message around the diversity of their workforce. And took it from there. I was disinfecting the COVID ward and with a smartphone and a GoPro on my chest strap, and yeah, that's how I got. That's how I did it initially.
Well, thanks for pitching in and being part of that solution. That can't have been easy to see all of that. It's such a close-up vantage point, but seems like it was really natural for you to start filming, and that's just so much part of what you were doing with your other work. And so I'm glad the hospital said yes. But through that filming, you were also seeing some inequities in terms of, you know, the migrants and certain benefits that the National Health Service was giving in Britain to certain people, but not others. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah. So when the pandemic initially hit, I felt like this is going to be something that is going to unite all of us. We are all in the same fight against the virus. And then I took the job. Part of the reason why I took the job at the hospital is because I wanted to join that national fight against COVID. But then a few weeks down the line, when I was watching what's happening on the news, and I seen like government failures in terms of like combating the pandemic, it was very disappointing, but I wanted to focus on my job. But then when they announced the bereavement scheme, which is to give you a bit of context, is a scheme to protect migrant workers. So a migrant working on the front line, if they die, their families get indefinite leave to remain. And then they decided to exclude people who were working with me, you know, people who I was breaking bed with, people who I was like spending 8 hours of my day with. So I couldn't understand. I mean, I fled a totalitarian country, and I was coming to Britain, to like one of the oldest democracies in the world. So I didn't expect that such a thing would even take place. So, but then I felt like I must do something, because I have a platform. Back then I had around 9,000 followers on Twitter. I know that I can, like, I'm ready to put myself on the forefront and talk about this. So I did it. It was my only protest. It was the only thing that I could do during lockdown, and did a video to Boris Johnson in which instigated a government U-turn, and as a result, it protected thousands of people's lives. And I think this is like this thread. It wasn't just in my story. In the film, you see that we all started fighting the pandemic, but then we realized that we're fighting what the pandemic has exposed in our communities and our societies. That was never planned. It was never scripted, but naturally, that's how the narrative of what we were doing was shaping up in real life. And yeah, so I was really proud of what happened. I mean, I was there to do the cleaning job, and I was also like sharing pictures of my colleagues online. I was sharing their stories. But then when it turned into a policy change, I was like, that's good, and that's what I would like to also like. That's initially what I want my message from my part of the film, or at least the whole film, is to inspire people that everyone can make a change. We all have the tools at our disposal to do something during this time.
You can't help yourself. You're a true activist.
Yeah, my mom said you can't just sit and not do something. You have to call out the British government. She was worried that they might deport me when I did that.
No, you were too much in the public eye at that point. You had to be safe. Yeah, so you spoke a little bit about your part of the story, and just Orlando or Hassan, you can both answer this. In terms of the other parts of the story, like, did each co-director have an individual vantage point that they were coming from, that they want, like the thesis of your mini film, if you will, your mini story, was that part of it, and everyone wanted to have kind of their own individual story? And how did you link those into the bigger story with that bigger question of like individuals creating change for the bigger picture?
Well, I'll start, Hassan. But I think this definitely began as a number of individuals documenting their response around the world to the pandemic. And then it was only after a number of weeks and months that you started to see these commonalities, these similarities between all the stories, or most of the stories, I should say, of actually what everybody starts to fight are these flaws in society, and then that all leading to, I guess, a kind of a climax of sorts where people end up on the streets, protesting. And obviously, that with Dr. Arman in Miami, that was in response to the murder of George Floyd. In Parasopolis in Sao Paulo with Renata, that is in response to the government turning off the water every night, and not providing support for people that are in some of the most vulnerable and marginalized communities in Brazil. And obviously Hassan just explains how his story fed into that process. So that in narratively is sort of what pulled together most of the stories and provides, I guess, the narrative thrust of the film.
Did you ever consider depicting a country that was doing well? I mean, I don't know if there really was like a true success story, but like New Zealand, for example, and how they came together. I know you said you were focusing kind of on populist governments and the flaws in those social systems and social nets, or the lack thereof. Did you consider doing something with someone who was like a better case study of that response?
Absolutely. To begin with, I guess we were looking at all sorts of different places that we could follow, and we definitely did consider that. And I think you're right. New Zealand has been a little bit of a beacon. There's a lot of countries in South Korea, Japan, in some ways. I think they've all shown a great way to deal with this, and the case numbers there are so unbelievably low when you compare them to the UK, for instance, and those are countries with populations, in Japan's case, like far bigger than the UK's, and there's been over 160,000 deaths in Britain. So we did consider that, but in the end you end up being led partly by the directors that we worked with, the strength of their storytelling, stories which felt that they appeal, they I guess the themes inherent in them felt more global and as an example, Sarah Karki's and Mohammed Reza Aini's story in Tehran, in some ways, their story of being stuck in their apartment and watching the news, being scared, all of those, frankly, triggering things that I think most of us experienced, that their story was almost the more global story. It's how most of us experienced the pandemic. And so those were, I guess, in the end, the ways that we honed in and chose individual narratives to follow.
In terms of conversation in the documentary field in general right now is a lot of it's about ethics and how to keep people safe and like the emotional weight that people carry of telling their own stories. Hassan, maybe you could speak a little bit to this, and anecdotes from others or the other co-directors are welcome too. But how did you maintain your mental health through all of this? Because you too were experiencing, maybe this was cathartic for you to make a film about this experience, but how did you maintain hope and mental health? Because I know we were all struggling.
I struggled. I mean, it's not my first crisis. I've been through my own fair share of crises before, but I struggled because I have never experienced something like this in my life, and just the level of fear. Because when I signed up to work at the hospital and I was filming, it was during the first wave when no one had any idea what was going on. So I'm just the number of death and seeing people dying on a daily basis. So it was physically and mentally challenging. But in the spirit of kindness, my friend Josie, because I was doing this job, she was so proud of me, and she said the only way I can support you is by providing you with private therapy. So I used to have these therapy sessions in the car, and I'm very privileged to be able to to have access to therapy. But that was very helpful to me because I wanted to offload. I wanted to talk about what I was seeing in the hospital because it was like a war zone. It certainly it was really hard, but on the other side, it's in a weird, strange way, it's being part. Being part of being a member of that group in that COVID ward, and we were all fighting together. I found purpose. I found I felt like I was doing something that was meaningful, that was valuable in a very, very extraordinary time. And I was quite proud of it. And being in a hospital also, which is treating people and not torturing them, it restored my faith in humanity. So overall, I think it was in a strange way, it was a positive experience. Although it had its effect on me, but it was a positive experience for me.
I had some of those realizations throughout. We go through, and I lost my father not due to COVID, but during this time, and because of the pandemic, I was actually able to go and spend time with him that I wouldn't have been able to otherwise. It was this. And I think it was like that for people. Like we all found these really strange silver linings that were happening in the world. And, for workers realizing maybe their job is killing them and that things need to change and people can band together and change them. And for racial justice and getting out in the streets, like we were talking about the opportunity for social change, like that's kind of what I was seeing that kept me hopeful. And I think you can see that in the film as well, that there's those threads of hope that keep people going, saying, oh, wait a minute, we were just stuck in this routine situation and it doesn't have to be that way. Sure. So that kind of goes to my next question, Orlando. What was the takeaway that you wanted people to have from the film? I know you mentioned, the unsettling, really heavy imagery that we were seeing and experiencing personally. So what was your hope with this film that people walk away with or discuss?
Thank you. I think there's a few. I guess on the most simple level, we've all gone through globally. You know, in my lifetime, I suppose, in all our lifetimes, I suppose it's one of the most significant global experiences we've all gone through, and it's full of I think we've all got these. We've carried a lot through it. I hope the film can provide a small bit of catharsis to watch it, to relive it. I mean, not, you know, yes, the film deals with some really difficult things, but there very much is a through line of hope in people. So I really, you know, I think all of us working on this, we really hope that comes through. I think we also, you know, in a very big way, hope that this film can show that change is possible. It focuses on people using all of their powers, but they, you know, they are everyday ordinary people, but that they can drive forward social change and coming together in that way. And I think that's something we all really care about. And I suppose lastly, it's about showing the commonality of us all. We're so divided as a world. We're really divided in so many ways. And this film is about trying to show the things that unite us over the things that separate us and make us believe that we're all really different. And I think this pandemic has really shown that the world really is small. We are all connected, and we have to work together to solve these giant global crises. And climate change, of course, is the really big one hanging over all of us. And maybe there's one lesson from the COVID pandemic is that to solve climate change, we've got to come together.
Hassan, any specifics from you of what you were hoping with the film? I think Orlando said a lot of really great points, but
how do you follow up on that? I just echo Orlando's sentiment around investing in people, investing in communities. I think people can do extraordinary things if they have access to proper education, if they have access to great healthcare, and yeah, I mean, you know, the vaccine was created because because people working together. Our hospitals were sustained because people were working together. Our shelves, shelves were stacked. People were delivering parcels and takeaways to our houses because of also the contribution of the migrant communities in their host communities. So I hope, I mean, all over Europe, migrants and refugees have done incredible acts of kindness, like just stepping up and working. So I hope that this also, you know, the anti-migrant and refugee rhetoric is constantly on the rise, sadly. So I hope that what happened in the pandemic will show us that, you know, we're technically we're all the same. It's a lottery that where we are born, but eventually we're all the same.
Well, you did almost top Orlando. I mean, that was really beautiful, beautifully said. And
I vote for him. I vote for Hassan.
Hassan wins. This is a competition. I didn't tell you guys that. But it's very true. It shined a light on the people that actually keep our society functioning, and they're often, you know, overlooked. And yeah, I agree with you. I think that this film has the potential to bring some light to that. I guess my last question for you guys before we wrap is, so we're still in the pandemic, as we know, year 2, and I'm just wondering that opportunity and hope for change, how do we keep this alive? And how do we, you know, in the face of so much misinformation and distrust, and how do we keep that spirit of collectivism and unification and, you know, the power's in the hands of the people? How do we keep that spirit? What are you guys doing to keep that spirit alive?
You want to start, Hassan?
How am I keeping the spirit of how am I making the spirit alive? What was that?
Yeah, so there's this, you know, we talked about the opportunity for change, and we're still in the pandemic. How do we keep this alive? Like for you guys, I imagine it's making more films and exposing more stories.
For me, it's telling more stories. For me, as you said, I mean, the level of misinformation is very, is quite scary actually, and it's costing people's lives. So I think in any topic, telling stories always work. We used to communicate. I mean, We used to communicate in stories thousands of years ago. So for me, I want to utilize my skills in storytelling, be it in photography or filmmaking, to keep that spirit alive. And my duty is also part of my activism and my small part in making this world a bit better.
I mean, I think Hassan said most of it there, and I suppose, you know, the small bit that we hope that the film can be something that maybe, if it inspires a couple of people, that would be big success. I suppose just a bigger thing to your question, Lisa, is I guess one hope, complete aside from the film, is that people can hold on to the sense of community that at least was apparent in the early days of the pandemic. And I think that was quite extraordinary. And that feeling of when you feel community, you feel that it's something worth fighting for. And it's worth fighting for the people, the citizens that live around you. And that's really important. And in big cities, that can often get lost. And I hope we can all draw strength from that.
Me too. That's my takeaway. I thank you guys so much, Hassan and Orlando, and all of the other co-directors that aren't with us today, for this beautiful film and for giving us a silver lining in an otherwise what has been a fairly dark time. I would like to dedicate this conversation to all the healthcare workers and migrant workers who kept things going for us for these past years now and will continue to, and hopefully we can all show a little more respect than we have been. So thank you guys very much on behalf of Film Independent, and thank you, Netflix.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you everyone for watching. It's been lovely to talk to you.